Today I'm going to talk about determinism, free will, and predestination. Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. This topic was requested of me by the viewer Wist, where he's asking for my thoughts on these things like materialistic determinism, theistic predestination, and free will. I'll come to the asterisk on predestination, because there is a Catholic doctrine of predestination that is not in any way opposed to the Catholic doctrine of free will. So the term predestination can have multiple meanings. I'm assuming he means the Calvinist or the like Martin Luther's version of it, where there's no such thing as free will, and we're all just puppets on strings. So, and you can see how this is the counterpart of, physicalism, naturalism, or materialism, as it used to be, until it was discovered that actually matter is really kind of energy. And so there isn't really such thing as matter in the sense that materialists even meant it. But that's okay, because what happened was the atheists who believed in materialism just changed the terminology and went on exactly the same as before. So the history of it is kind of amusing if you really get into the details, which I don't have time for here. But so when it comes to physical materialistic determinism, okay, so basically a really simple version of this. Now there are actually kind of two versions that you find. There's the proper one, the one that's basically derived from 3D billiards, that materialism held that, okay, so the world is just a 3D billiard game. There are these atoms, they're bouncing around, and whereas normal billiards is on a 2D, or pool is on a 2D table, and the balls bounce into each other and stuff. What we have is actually 3D billiards, where stuff is bouncing around in 3 space, but same basic thing. If you knew the initial positions and the momentum of every particle, then eventually you could predict the entire state of everything unto the end of time, or just forever if there is no end of time. Okay, so that was the simple materialist version. You find this in the 1800s, the early 1900s, and unfortunately quantum came in and put an end to it. But that didn't really make a difference to the people who hold it anyway, because they tend to say okay, well, maybe it's all indeterminate, but maybe it's just we can't predict it. Maybe we can't measure accurately. We can't know the initial positions and so on. And so it's still the case that if you could, and we just don't know the underlying hidden variables and don't have access to them. So maybe it's all just 3D billiards anyway, but we can't. No, that's not actually what quantum mechanics says. But that doesn't matter. No one really cares about that. It's least of all the atheists who claim to believe in physics. So the point here, and it doesn't really matter which version of this you go with, is that they all suffer from the same basic problem, that there is not a shred of evidence that the hypothesis is true. It's really just a complete assumption. Because what was materialism? And just super briefly, okay, so there's nothing but matter and its interactions. That's the only thing that exists. There's nothing else. There is no supernatural. Supernatural, incidentally, being a Christian concept to distinguish supernature from nature, which essentially is God from creation, roughly speaking. It's, again, the history of some of this in specific is kind of amusing when you see how much was cribbed without understanding by modern atheists. But anyway, amusing stuff aside, the point is, materialism started out with that hypothesis. Now, what is the evidence that everything that exists is only matter and its interactions? None. None at all. What evidence could there possibly be that everything that exists is matter and its interactions and there's nothing else? Well, unless you're omniscient, none. You can't possibly know that. You have no way of determining that that is in fact the case. You cannot go and investigate and exclude in all cases, in all situations, that everything that went on was nothing but matter and its interactions, according to deterministic formula. So there's kind of a problem with materialism in that it is an assumption. That's it. It's purely an assumption. It's an assumption that there is nothing else. Why would you assume this? Well, that's more psychological. What evidence do you have that this could be true? None. None whatever. What evidence can you have? None. So when you then meet the experience of free will, because we all experience free will, or at least most of us do. I mean, maybe by hypothesis, the people who deny free will actually are automatons. There was some sort of birth defect, they didn't get a soul, and so they're actually automatons that don't experience free will, that can't actually make choices, that just go through life not choosing anything, but just, they're NPCs, to use the modern term. So maybe the people who tell you there is no free will are in fact actually what they claim to be. Maybe they are soulless automatons who don't experience free will, and this is why they doubt it. I mean, I don't know. I assume not. I assume they're human beings with souls who are simply mistaken, but, just as a detail, if anyone's ever telling you that there's no such thing as free will, you could point out, well, maybe you don't experience free will. Maybe you're a soulless automaton, but I experience free will. There's nothing they could possibly answer to that. They'll tell you, oh, that doesn't convince me. It's like, well, if you're a soulless automaton, I couldn't convince you, and why would I try? I don't try to convince my car of anything. I don't try to convince my couch of anything. I don't try to convince the walls of anything. Why would I convince you if you're a soulless automaton? What would be even the point of trying to convince you of anything, since, like, you're not like a rational soul, like, you don't have a rational soul like I do, by your hypothesis. That's your testimony, right? So, like, and that's a rhetorical point to some degree, although it is actually like a practical point too. Like, if somebody denies free will, maybe he doesn't have it. Solves the problem very neatly. Solves the problem in like an intellectual sense very neatly, because I experience free will. All my friends tell me they experience free will. Frankly, many of the people who deny free will say that they experience it and that it's just an illusion. So, there's the thing. We experience it. We have direct experience of it. So if we experience something that a hypothesis with no evidence doesn't explain, is the sensible conclusion that this hypothesis that there is no reason to believe, that there's no evidence for, is true and we're just experiencing an illusion, even though like we directly experience it? Or is the sensible conclusion, well, your hypothesis is false because it leaves out of account something we directly experience, and according to you, this thing doesn't exist, but we experience it, and there's no reason to believe this hypothesis, so isn't the rational thing here, like, that it's false? So, like, suppose I were to believe there's no such thing as a swan, right? I've got the hypothesis, the world exists except for swans, and you say, like, well, there's some in the lake right over there. They say, oh, well, obviously those are an illusion. Because, by hypothesis, the world doesn't have swans. The swan, seems sensible to you to say that those things over there that I'm looking at right now, those are an illusion. Because, why? Oh, because I assume there are no swans. Can you prove that they're swans? Well, I can see them. Well, that's not proof. That's just an illusion that they're swans. That's basically what the argument goes. That's how it goes. And it's that absurd. I know I normally make up very absurd examples because absurd examples are easier, but this is exactly the same thing. You have actually a much more direct experience of free will, because free will is not mediated by your senses that can be fooled because you have sense organs and nerves and so on, and so, you have limited information at the extent of it and so on. And so, you can see, there might be such thing as an illusion, something that presents something to your eyes that isn't really there. And in some sense, that's what computer screens are, is they're an illusion. There isn't, really a, like when you're watching some people, when you're watching a movie, there aren't really people in front of you. There's sort of an illusion. The image of people in front of you is being presented to you, but there aren't actually people in front of you. So in some sense, like a movie is an illusion. Computer screens are all illusions in some technical sort of sense. I don't mean they're magic, they're just technology. Believe me, I could explain to you in great detail, including things like how liquid crystal displays work and how they vary from OLEDs and so on. I am quite the geek, or nerd. I don't know, haven't kept track of exactly those terms, but I find that technology interesting. Yes, these things are technology, they're not magic, but they are illusory in the sense of what seems to be there is not in fact there. Okay, so point being, our senses can be fooled because there can be external stimuli that are like other external stimuli. it is possible to have defects even in the nerves. The images that we see, in fact, are filtered by our brain in order to integrate things over time. And we know this to be the case, and we even experience it to be the case in a proper sense. So, yeah, I mean, you have to think about it. You don't think about it normally, but if you do, you know, you even directly experience that. The point being that the senses can be fooled because they only ever have partial information. There's a lot of intermediation. We directly experience free will. We directly experience ourselves choosing things, and it's not intermediated through sensory organs where there can be multiple kinds of information that may sort of come out through the filter of our sense organs to be the same or other such things. We directly experience it. We experience it with far greater certitude than we do any observation you can possibly make about the world. And the materialist tells you, well, disregard the direct evidence that you constantly experience and instead go with my completely unsupported theory. Sometimes they will sneer at you and say, like, oh, can you prove my unsupported theory is false? And you know, my favorite version of this, by the way, is when it tends to go something along the lines of, wow, if you can prove that there actually is such thing as free will, you should do that, and then you'll get a Nobel Prize. To which I actually had someone say something to that effect recently, and I pointed out, they don't give out Nobel Prizes for what has been common knowledge for millennia. Anyway, point being, that basically is materialistic determinism. Completely unsupported, direct evidence to the contrary, and we're supposed to believe it because, I don't know, because the iPhone? Yeah, but I have an Android device, so checkmate atheists. Joking aside, there's never the reason I present it this way is that there's never a good argument given, because there can't be a good argument given. So all you ever get is some sort of rhetoric, usually trying to equate holding that an assumption that a simplistic model is complete and covers absolutely everything is somehow equivalent to you have to reject technology. Basically, you often see this argued on the internet, more or less by people of the sort of tribal affiliation where, like, technology is magic that works, so I'm going to, like, follow them and assume. Oh, there are tons of assumptions that go into this. Don't have time for them all. That's basically what you see. It's you can't have good arguments for it. You don't see anything that's a good argument for it. You usually don't even see good rhetoric for it, but you can have good rhetoric for false things. It's pretty straightforward to have good rhetoric for false things. You know, like for example, you know, Yoda's try, do or do not. There is no try. Yeah, there is. Trying is how you actually learn to do things. You try and you fail, and then eventually you succeed by trying repetitively. And you don't, like, you know, when Luke said, you know, I'll try, what he means is, I will attempt to do this, and I can't guarantee you of the result. And the idea that either you refuse to do something or you guarantee the result is idiotic. It's good rhetoric, though. Like, you know, do or do not. Do or do not. There is no try. My Yoda voice is horrible, and I apologize. Anyway, point being, great rhetoric for something entirely false. And you can see great rhetoric for false things all the time. You usually don't even see great rhetoric for this. You see tremendous, like, force of will. You see a lot of sneering about it, and that's most of what you see. Funny thing, by the way, that the kind of determinism that I just described, 3D billiards style, and its variants, because of course, like, the original one can't be maintained, so there are some trivially modified versions that attempt to update and don't work. But anyway, attempt to update. So that family of things, that's what you see. Curiously, you also see a lot of determinism at a higher level than this. That, by the way, sort of encompasses, like, also the like neuroscience version, which is the we can't predict which neurons are firing, therefore there's no free will. But we can. I forget what the intermediate step is. It's like we can't predict actually how nerves will fire in exactly what way and so on. It's far too complex for us. We don't even come close. However, there's certain things that, like, we can regularly observe that we can assume mean particular things, and if we're right in our assumptions, which there's no reason to believe, and also if these measurements, which aren't as accurate as we need them to be, or we're taken to be sufficiently accurate, even though they're clearly not. And there are a few more assumptions that go into it. Then, clearly, this entirely explains the system, and there's nothing else. And again, just one of those things. If you make a bunch of assumptions that you don't have evidence for, and you can't really have evidence for, then it can contradict direct experience, and so you're supposed to throw away direct experience for the unevidenced assumptions. And it's the same basic thing, because the way nerves fire is taken to be deterministic, and this, just as the epiphenomenon of 3D billiards. There's another kind of determinism which you also frequently see, even though it's basically incompatible with this, and that is the determinism of the instinctual determinism, that the human creature does things by its instincts, and we only explain them afterwards as rational decisions. Just so bizarre. We've all experienced actual things that are instincts. We don't afterwards say, I used calculative reason to rationally come to the conclusion that I wanted to pull my hand back because that thing was hot. You don't do that. You say, I jerked my hand back instinctively. When you experience instinctual behavior, you call it instinctual behavior. You don't post hoc explain it because you have some need to come up with this concept of rationality that doesn't exist and explain things by this non-existent concept. Non-existent meaning that there's no referent to it, that the concept doesn't refer to anything. I should call it an empty concept. But no one's ever experienced rationality, doesn't really exist, but we have a word for it, and we like to pretend that we're rational. Why? No explanation. Anyway, that sort of thing, which actually is incidentally contradictory to it's all subatomic particles bouncing around in 3D billiard style, or laws of physics determine the outcome. Because this one holds that they're instincts that determine the outcome. That regardless of what the subatomic particles are doing, the instinct is going to carry this out. And it's actually really interesting to see how common that is when it doesn't work. They should be determinists at the lower level, but you see these determinists at the higher level. And it's really kind of fascinating. And just sort of a fun fact about this. Actually, fun fact's not the right word. But anyway, interesting thing. A friend of mine is a philosophy professor, said that he's of the opinion that determinism is largely, essentially, a myth that certain, especially atheistic philosophers, tell themselves as a way of understanding why it is that they don't persuade anybody. So they've got all these thoughts that persuade them very well, and they try to explain it to other people, and the other people don't get it. And they don't understand why, why not? And so they have this myth that, it's because they don't really have free will. They cannot actually be rational. They're just animals controlled by their instincts, and so they can't understand the philosophy that I've presented to them, because that's not what they are. They're not the sort of things that can do it. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, because as I said, they should not maintain this. They should maintain a completely different level of determinism that would not permit the existence of things like instincts. Instincts are at best epiphenomenon that go to explain. Instincts are essentially, to use quasi-Humean terminology, they are a recurrent phenomenon to which we give the same name because they remind us of each other. So eating when you're hungry is an instinct, because the various instances of eating remind us of each other. And so we say that the animal has an instinct to do this thing because we see it doing this sort of thing over and over again. You couldn't actually, on a deterministic assumption, you can't actually define any of these things in such a way that these ideas actually exist. Instincts as they are described normally are actually ideas that are supposed to have, abstractions. Really, Platonic ideals that things participate in, and that just does not work with materialistic determinism at all, even though this is an incredibly common form of it, which means that something else must be going on, and I suspect that's in fact it. Okay, so that's determinism, physical determinism. Now, on the flip side, you get the two major versions of theistic predestination, which I'm going to take to be predestination exclusive of free will, are the Calvinistic one and the Lutheran one. By which I mean Martin Luther, not the Lutheran Church, because they, from what I gather, have very little to do with Martin Luther. Their naming is almost accidental. So, very briefly, in Institutes of the Christian Religion, John Calvin basically said that human beings used to have free will back when before the fall, but that in the fall our nature was destroyed, and part of our nature was to have free will, and so that was destroyed too, and so we became incapable of free will. We can only be evil. We can't choose the good. He did mention as an asterisk, if you want to try to say that like maybe we still have the last little dregs of will that can't actually do anything useful but are still kind of there like trying unsuccessfully to accomplish something, he's not going to bother to argue the point since it has no practical effect. But it's not technically speaking the same thing, and so like if you want to say that our free will was not completely destroyed and we do technically have free will, it just can't actually accomplish, it's not strong enough to accomplish anything, who cares at the difference? If that makes you happy, go for it, was basically what he said, although far less pleasantly. Because the Institutes of the Christian Religion is a book absolutely dripping with vitriol. I mean, he wrote that in like a mixture of snake venom and acid rather than ink. It is amazing just how much that man hated so many people. It is a very phenomenally difficult book to read. It is the only book I've ever really wanted to burn, just because it was so painful. I only read like a 50 pages of it, I think, many years ago. That was rough. Anyway, so that's the Calvinistic version. Martin Luther's version is that the free will isn't even a meaningful concept. There's never been such a thing as free will. We're all just puppets dancing on God's strings, and at the end. And so, we don't do anything at all. This is just a big play that God is like having for himself. It's the end of it. So this is Martin Luther's book On the Bondage of the Will, by the way, which is also an amazing book because, whoo boy, is Martin Luther not a very smart man who thinks that he is, and oh boy, does Martin Luther have, let me put it this way, his reproductive organs probably have measurable gravity. I have never seen anybody nearly so confident that he is right about things that he clearly isn't in such an extraordinary way. In particular, his when he talked about how he had a section in it where he talked about Scripture and how some parts of Scripture are difficult to understand, but that's only because they're phrased badly. But they say the same things as parts of Scripture that are easier to understand. And in order to make this claim, he has to claim to have a thorough and complete knowledge and understanding of Holy Scripture. That there's nothing in Holy Scripture he does not understand or know. Wow. That is astonishing. That is just truly astonishing. He is one, I can kind of see why he's a big figure in history, because most people don't have the testicular fortitude to say stuff like that. Okay, so anyway, point is, those are the two major versions of it. You can find other versions that are pretty similar, like Buddhism can be deterministic. You can find Hinduism's versions of Hinduism that are deterministic in roughly that same way as like Martin Luther, that free will just isn't a thing, never was a thing. See, the great thing about John Calvin's version is that it exculpates God from evil, that humans chose evil, and then all evil that follows is simply the deterministic consequence of their evil choice. But God created the world good and the world went bad, whereas Martin Luther actually believes that evil is part of, that God is the author of evil, and that evil is part of the world. And this is a very important distinction, because it radically changes the nature of the God that you're worshiping if you hold God to be the author of evil. As opposed to free-willed creatures are the author of evil, and God is actively working against it, and that free-willed creatures, though they choose evil, will not in the end frustrate God, and will not end up defeating God, but that God will save the world. So there's a huge difference between these two, although John Calvin himself tended to go more or less, like, he still went with the Massa Damnata idea. Like, the problem was he kind of went radically off the rails with salvation. I mean, he went off the rails when he denied free will, and then went even further with salvation because he just hated everyone, as far as I can tell. Don't know that for certain. I don't have the gift of reading souls, but oh boy, did it seem like he hated everyone. Now, but John Calvin aside, that's sort of the two ways you can go with theistic determinism. Either sin destroyed free will, and so you have total depravity, but as a novelty. It's not what God. It's not what God created the world to be. God created the world to be good, and the world chose to turn away from it. And just in sort of a complete and irrevocable way. And the other way you can go about it is there's no such thing. When you come to the former one, roughly speaking, it is. I mean, John Calvin went to some pretty. Like, he went off the rails, then just kept on going even further and further away from the rails. And that's probably telling, frankly. You get the further problem. And this answers both of them, really. Because there's an interesting letter where St. Augustine talked about. In his day, it was on grace and free will. And he wrote a letter on grace and free will. Grace being essentially what's referred to here as theistic predestination. And in his letter, that he answered several of the standard arguments, but one of the biggest ones that he brought up was that the Bible is full of moral laws telling us to choose one thing and not another. This would be stupid if we can't choose. This would be pointless. It would be fruitless. It would be saying that God is doing something intrinsically fruitless, because telling a rock to choose one thing and not another thing is a fruitless action. And if God is... God can create ancestors of Abraham out of rocks. I don't mean to say that that if you have the power to change the nature of a rock, that changing the nature of a rock would be fruitless, but rather leaving it still a rock and commanding it to do what it cannot do is a fruitless action. In the same way, telling a person, jump to the moon, is a fruitless action. They can't. It's not possible. They cannot comply with this. It is a pointless thing to do. It has no end. There is no goal that it actually has. Martin Luther tried to claim, incidentally, that the goal was to convince people that they're evil. But, why would you convince puppets? Kind of like what I said, I don't try to convince my car of anything. I don't try to convince the walls of anything. Why would you convince puppets who have no ability to choose that they're evil? What would be the point of it? But, you can't. I mean, they couldn't do anything with this being convinced, because they're puppets. They have no free will. They can't do... There's nothing they can do. They can't choose anything. They can't... because, the idea was to, that you then don't try to act on your own but throw yourself entirely on grace. But you can't do that if there's no free will. The problem is determinists... This is the thing, by the way. And this kind of... In some sense, you can, you could stop right here. Determinists are never consistent. They always act as if you can do something with the knowledge of determinism. They always act like there's some reason that they are speaking. And, even if they're telling you about determinism, they act like there's a reason, a point to this, when their hypothesis is that there is no point. And if you don't believe me... Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to hit the microphone. If you don't believe me, go talk to a rock for a while. Go try to actually exhort a rock to something. Go seriously do it as a thought, not a thought experiment, as a real experiment. Find a rock, lecture it for a while, see what that's like. You don't do it. You're going to stop. You're going to stop because you know the thing is completely pointless. And the fact that determinists don't stop, even though in their mind what they're doing is exactly the same, in their theory what they're doing is exactly that same thing, tells you they don't actually believe it. And why should they ask you to believe what they clearly don't believe themselves? So, I mean, there's that. And in some sense you can stop there. But just to sort of carry it through, sort of for the interest of it. Okay, so there's no point in convincing somebody that they can't do anything because they can't do anything. So if you convince them of it, they still can't do anything. If you don't convince them of it, they couldn't do anything. Exactly the same outcome. No difference whatsoever in the outcome. It's a fruitless action. It cannot possibly bear any fruit because there cannot be any difference whatsoever in whether based upon whether you succeed or fail. Comes out exactly the same. It's indistinguishable. So this is holding that the Martin Luther type answer is holding that God does completely fruitless things, pointless, utterly pointless and meaningless actions. And as I said, the only reason it even sounds a little bit plausible is simply because he's throwing away the determinism at this point. But at this point, he's kind of sort of using determinism as a metaphor for we are fallen, we are weak. And so it is very true that if you try to rely upon your own strength rather than relying upon the strength of God, you will fail because you need the strength of God. That would be true if you weren't fallen too. It's just like, we're creatures in the same way that like Hamlet can't do anything apart from Shakespeare. Well, we can't do anything apart from God. And so, yeah, if you try to do something apart from God, it's going to be a failure necessarily, obviously, because you can't. Like fallen, unfallen, same thing. And just that you can't operate on your own is saying you need to try to be perfect. Because to be perfect is to rely upon God. So, so like, that's why this sounds good at all, because there is like an actual Catholic Orthodox, Orthodox message here, which has been preached down through the centuries, that like you need to depend on God, because you do depend on God. So you have to act in accordance with reality and not with some fantasy whereby you're your own little God who created itself. So yeah, like that's true, but that's not what any of that thing that Martin Luther said means. Unfortunately, it kind of just sounds like it, so he gets away with it for some people. But the point is, that right there, St. Augustine's answer, that like the Bible tells you to, God within the Bible, within Scripture, within history, tells people to choose things. Well, choose some things and not others. Well, you wouldn't do that if you couldn't choose something instead of another thing. Because like God doesn't do fruitless actions. God's word doesn't go out and return to him void. So yeah, like right there, straight up, that God's plan for the world, predestination in the Catholic sense of the word, does not negate free will, because everything would be stupid if it did. And God isn't stupid. So, like anything that requires you to interpret Scripture to be profoundly stupid is probably a bad interpretation, was a heuristic that he gave, and it's a darn good heuristic. Okay, so there's that one. Then there are a few other things like, came up, the argument people will sometimes use about God's foreknowledge of the world. And of course, God is outside of time, and so sees, all things are present to God, and God's eternal now. And so God's knowledge of the future is not, God isn't in time with us in the same moment, confined to that moment, and thus predicting the future, stepping outside of this moment while remaining inside of it. God is entirely outside of the moment. I mean, God's also, God is present in every moment, fully and completely, because God's the author of the world. So God's, more intimate to us than we are to ourselves, really. But God is not confined to a moment. And so, there's sort of the answer. But I really liked something that St. Augustine had said, that if God knows the choices that we make before we make them, it is not nothing that God knows. That is to say, that God's foreknowledge of our choice does not eliminate the choice, because if it did, then there would be no content to what God knew. We would not be making a choice. So God wouldn't know what the choice was, because there wasn't going to be a choice. If we are deterministic, if we cannot make a choice, we don't make any choices. If we don't make any choices, God can't know them, because God can't know things that don't exist. You can't know something that does not exist. You can conceive of it, you can know it in an abstract sense, but you cannot know, in a particular sense, a thing which doesn't exist, because it's not there. It doesn't have a being to know. You can't know it. And so, I just understood in that way, which is, what St. Augustine meant. If God knows the choices that we make before we make them, it is not nothing that God knows. That is to say that people were trying to say that the foreknowledge of God, basically they tried to say that like the foreknowledge of God is impossible. And so let's try to make this easier for God, because like God couldn't possibly be great enough to actually know choices before they happen and for them to be real choices at the same time. God can't possibly be that great. God's only like us but bigger, and we couldn't do that even if we're bigger. So like obviously there are no choices. So therefore that would be doable, because us but bigger could know if no one was actually making choices, us but bigger could know that. So like, yeah, there we go. And what St. Augustine is saying is, stop underestimating God. God doesn't have the same nature as us. God is not one being among many. And so don't don't try to operate under the assumption that God has the same sort of limitations that we do, and that the foreknowledge of choices precludes them from being choices. Okay, so let me see. Anything else in theistic determinism that really comes up very often? Most of the rest of the stuff that comes up is some variant thereof. I think that's pretty much it. And then on free will, we directly experience free will. We know what free will is like. We make choices. We make good choices. We make bad choices. We also have the experience of not making choices. We have the experience of things like instinct. We have the experience of things like physical limitations, like I can't choose to fly like this because it doesn't work. Free will is by no means unlimited. Free will can be, our free will can very much be curtailed. You are less free when you're drunk or high. You're less free when you've been put asleep by anesthetics, because you can't choose anything at that point. Obviously, our free will can be curtailed. Our free will is not unlimited. I don't know of anybody who ever thought it was, because that directly contradicts experience. Don't go down the ghost in the machine route. Ghost in the machine, like the Cartesian, the mind-body duality problem. I mean, obviously, material and spirit are not the same thing, but holding them to be completely unlike each other in every way whatsoever, to have nothing to do with each other, and then somehow interact with each other. And thus you had Descartes trying to figure out, how does the soul control the body? As if it's the soul is in a little control room pulling knobs and levers to make things happen, rather than the soul actually being, to use the, in some sense Aristotelian, but I'm going to use it in the Thomistic sense, the form of the body. That the soul is, the soul is, for us, our soul is united to our body. Not in the sense of they're two things that have been glued together or there's a string going between them, but the two things form one being. That, the soul survives. I liked Edward Feser's description, that you can have your hand cut off and still be a human being. And so death is like a full body amputation, but you're missing your body. You're missing your body. There's something actually missing there, in the same way that if your hand gets cut off, there's something missing. And so the fact that the soul can survive the death of the body doesn't mean that the soul is better without the body or anything like that. But also doesn't mean that the soul and the body are not really related things. They are directly related, which is what makes death a privation, which is what makes death a loss. That the soul can no longer, the soul and body together no longer function correctly for the body to continue living, and so the body dies, it decays, it falls apart, it fails to fulfill its telos, and then that is death. Don't go down that route. It's not, when the soul and the body are united and form one being, it's then not mysterious why it is you can get drunk and your free will is reduced. As long as you avoid a Cartesian dualism, that's not a problem. And basically it's obviously true because we directly experience it, and there is about the only thing we experience more directly than free will is the mere fact of our existence. As Descartes started with, is there anything you can know with mathematical certainty? Well, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. So, clearly there is something, and, that something is me. I know that I exist, clearly, because I experience my own existence at a fundamental level. And, I know that, at least. So, there's that. The next thing is, I'm choosing stuff. I can choose what to think about and so on. So, choice is, the second most fundamental thing we know of. We experience it more directly than we experience anything else. So, it really doesn't make sense to overthrow our direct experience, our most fundamental direct experience, your second most fundamental direct experience, on the basis of theories for which there is no evidence and can't even in theory be evidence. Yeah, that's it's everything I can think of. I mean, I know it's a little anticlimactic that like there isn't a lot to say about free will, but like this is one of those things. Like if somebody tells you, "Prove to me that there's the ground," you don't mount really elaborate proofs. You don't say like, "Okay, gonna need 6 months. We're gonna construct some amazing laboratory equipment. This is going to be hard to follow, but I'll walk you through every step, and at the end of it, at long last, you will see some solid proof for the ground." It's right there. That's you know that thing down there? You know how you're not falling? That thing you're not falling through. That's the ground, right? So free will is kind of the same thing. Like you're not going to mount some giant elaborate machinery to find the most obvious thing that exists. I mean, amongst other things, it's kind of problematic to use something that is less certain to find something that is more certain. It kind of doesn't really work. So like, if I tell you that like, you know, here is, look at the person here swearing this oath that he has done something, or you know, that he holds a belief, right? Say let's say a loyalty oath, right? You know, like loyalty to the club, whatever. I don't care. Doesn't matter. And so like here's the person swearing the loyalty oath. I'm like, yeah, but I only saw him do it. Can you find some gossip that indicates that he did it? Well, he kind of only did it in front of you. I mean, it's kind of hard to come up with some gossip for something that, like, I mean, I guess you could tell other people and eventually the gossip will get around, maybe? But, like, right now, no, because you haven't told anybody yet? It's like, well, I mean, I only directly experienced it, but there's no gossip saying that it happened. So, man, I have no way of believing in it. But if you could bring up a bunch of gossip telling me that this happened, then I'll finally believe in it. You wouldn't do that. It doesn't make sense. You don't go to something less reliable to overthrow something, you know, to establish something that you have more reliable evidence for. So, like, that's just not how the world works. That's not how you do anything. You don't go to things of lesser certainty in order to have, you know, in preference to things of greater certainty. So there isn't really a lot to say about free will because, like, I mean, at the end of the day, the people who say we don't have free will are just idiots. I mean, that's... I know it's not nice to say, but, like, I mean, deny something else of equal thing. Like, deny that there is air and challenge people to prove that there is air and see how many people actually take you seriously. See how many people think that you're one of the leading lights of science because you've got the no air theory. And air is just an illusion because there's the no air theory and, like, you haven't seen any good proof for air. And see how seriously people take you. They don't. They're not going to. They're just going to say you're an idiot. And, I mean, you know, look at the fate of the flat earthers. You know, I don't know how many of them are actually serious, but, you know, in any event, it's kind of the same thing. Although the flat earth, you know, the round earth is less directly obvious than if you adopt the no air theory. But, like, the no free will theory is even more ridiculous than is the no air theory. Where's your proof for this thing we directly experience? Well, right there. You said it yourself. And so, yeah, I know it's it's kind of one of those funny things that, like, occasionally the truth is just so obvious that you can't really mount a very good defense for it because, like, it's right there in front of your face. And if that's not good enough for you, there are two options. And basically the only actual option is you're a moron. And, like, that cuts off all possibility of dialogue, I know, and that's really unfortunate. But if a person's going to deny the most obvious things there are, you're not going to have a useful dialogue with them anyway. It's sad, it's unfortunate, and it's kind of not avoidable, though. I mean, at the end of the day, if a person's going to deny the most obvious thing, if a person's going to deny the most certain proof that exists, what wouldn't they deny? And what common ground could you possibly have? And what would be the point? Because you only deny the most obvious things there are for some reason, you know, because you have an ulterior motive, at which point why would you believe they wouldn't just, if you go through some more complicated thing on the basis of, if you go, instead of, looking at the person swearing the oath, and you finally find them a bunch of gossip, you know what? They're not actually going to believe the gossip either. And if they won't accept the best proof, they're not going to accept the worst proof. Yeah, it's really sad. It's really unfortunate. I know it sucks. It sucks. Like, we should be able to have some way of going forward anyway, but you know what? There isn't always. Because sometimes people make choices, and those choices cut them off from other people. That includes the choice to deny the obvious. And it's really unfortunate, but there you are. And until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.